if you're feeling like there's something missing in your relationship, or if there's a struggle, I think you really need to self-evaluate, like, how vulnerable am I being? Am I actually being vulnerable? Am I sharing but not really like super deep? It takes a lot of courage to be open with someone. Like, it can't just be me
Wow.
being vulnerable. It has to be, everyone in the group or in a relationship. Today we are talking about vulnerability, and I love this subject because we discuss this a lot with my clients, and the importance of vulnerability. And Brene Brown actually has a great way of talking about it in her book, The Atlas of the Heart. So I'm just going to share a quote from her, and then we'll get kind of jump in. And it says, vulnerability is not oversharing. It's sharing with people who have earned the right to hear our stories and our experiences. And I love that because I think vulnerability has a lot to do with trust. And it also, we can't connect with people if we're not being vulnerable. But being vulnerable is so hard.
It is so hard, and it's vital for our health too, because if we're not connecting, then that has an impact on our well-being and our health
Mm-hmm.
and our way how we perform.
Mm-hmm.
And being vulnerable is really a fundamental component, but it's scary. So we're going to talk about that too. It's how do we do that and not be scared to share, but also how do we know not to share too much?
Right.
Not about just unloading everything on
Right.
everything, because that's
Like I do.
not good either. So we're going to cover all that in this episode. Welcome. I'm Heike Fallon, and I'm a personal high performance coach, and I help my clients with their self leadership to be better leaders. And we know now, from a scientific standpoint, too, vulnerability is very important to be an effective leader because you do
Mhm.
build those relationships.
I am Shannon Passalacqua, and I too am a high performance coach, and I specialize in helping women heal after miscarriage. And when you've gone through a miscarriage and grief like that, it is extremely difficult to be vulnerable with yourself and with your partner. So there's a lot of talk in my sessions about how to be more vulnerable and how to make that connection again with your partner, because sometimes you lose that, um, because there's a lot of shame that's built in with miscarriages. So it's a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, and one that is, I think, really interesting. Like, there's so much connection with the word vulnerability. There's so many different ways that it comes into our life, and um, I think a lot of it has to do with trust.
It absolutely does. And I want to first start though a little bit on the fundamental component with the science and how our brain functions. Just a quick one. Not that there's
Of course you do.
not that there's a test at the end or anything, but I think it's super important
But it's important to know the science.
when we understand a little bit more how the brain functions, right? Because the
Yeah.
brain has to keep us alive. That's its job. And in order to do so, it predicts what will happen. And that's what makes vulnerability so hard, because if we're putting ourselves out there a little bit and we're showing vulnerability, then it's hard to predict for the brain what's going to happen. And that will be hard then to know, are we safe or not? So it makes it hard for the brain to make the decision. And before it's taking a risk, it will do will respond more with a threat response, which then makes us more closed up and protect ourselves. And we're not as vulnerable because of, so it's kind of like a tricky thing.
Well, and
You
there's
can't just go, oh, just be vulnerable and share.
right.
It's not that easy.
Well, and that goes also with what Brene Brown says about courage and vulnerability. And she says there is no courage without vulnerability.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of courage to be open with someone.
Uh,
And because there is that, that mechanism that like it could shut us down.
yeah.
And
And
yeah.
that's, yeah. And that's why it's so important um, to really start with first that self awareness, I think, to first know, like, where do I need to be more vulnerable? Where am I showing up vulnerable enough, or am I sharing too much sometimes that isn't appropriate for the situation, which is
Right.
sometimes more what my clients have to kind of find a good balance in either their jobs or even as in your relationship with your partner or in family members. Is like how much vulnerability and which vulnerability is the right
Hmm.
amount at the time for the topic.
Yeah. And I think where I struggle and where I think my clients struggle is how can I become vulnerable again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's this self-preservation of I became vulnerable when I was pregnant and I let myself love and connect with this baby inside of me and then I lost it. And so now I don't want to become vulnerable again and let my guard down again. And so going from that, like, okay, we have to work through what does vulnerability mean to me and the steps and how do I become more vulnerable? What do I need to do? And that's a lot of self work.
Yeah. So let's say first a couple of things of like what usually holds us back to be more vulnerable. Like you said, that awareness of like, what is
Mhm.
it? Is it am I afraid of being judged? Is oftentimes the case, right? So am I going to share this? What are other people thinking? Are they going to judge me in a specific way?
Right.
Sometimes it's also just in general, like we want to feel in control, right? But the more we feel in control, the more our brain feels safe and it's
Yeah.
comfortable and we feel comfortable. But when we're vulnerable, then it is also like, am I losing a little bit? We will be losing slightly control because there's an amount of uncertainty. Like you said, we need that for the courage, but it also is part of growth because if we're not vulnerable and we're not actually um, putting ourselves out there a little bit more, showing courage, then also we're not gaining any new skills or the confidence we need to grow for ourselves more. So is it sometimes being afraid of not having the authority anymore, the control of the situation? So is that what holds you back from being more vulnerable? So the judgment, the control. But I also think sometimes certain cultural expectations can have a factor in it.
Mm,
And that's something everybody needs to kind of, check in with
yeah.
themselves. Am I holding back because of that, what is expected from me in particular in my culture and by my environment, my community? So am I just kind of afraid to push the boundaries because of certain expectations around me?
I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it about cultures, but that's really true. And I would also say there's got to be a difference between sexes, men and women. And, I think it's much more difficult for men to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and that comes back to actually I think too, which I've been reading the book about the culture of mindset. And so if we're in a culture of what's called the genius culture of mindset, meaning the ones where it's all about like, how good you look, your accomplishments, it's all about that. Or are we in a
Yeah.
culture of growth, which depends on what kind of company you're working for example, or what kind of, institution you're part of, or, your circle of friends or families? Is it more a culture of growth where failure is okay, where it's okay that we all look at it as a learning process together? Or is it all about showing, hey, I accomplished this, I accomplished that? And when we're in that kind of culture, it's much harder to show our vulnerability. So I think there's that whole component to it as well, which makes it harder. So it's not that easy to go like, oh, just be more vulnerable when the culture that you're in is
Hmm.
all about you only get validated, promoted, or whatever if you show perfectionism.
Hmm. That is really interesting because when I think about like my friendships and my communities that I'm in, I used to be in a group of friends who were very judgmental. And there was no failure. And it was really hard for someone like me who is an empath and someone who just kind of I do tend to overshare. uh, I that connection. I am not someone who can have a surface level conversation. I just can't do it. I like to go deep. But it was a very judgy type of group of friends, and I couldn't be myself. And the community that I'm in now, the friends that I have now, it's so funny because if I fail at anything, it's like they're like, oh, that's good. That's like they're so supportive. Like, well, that's fine because it means that blah 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 blah. And they're not judging me based on my failures.
So I think
And what?
I think that matters because then it's a little easier to be more vulnerable and connect on a deeper level because at the end of the day, it's an environment of trust that's created from us and from others. And that will help deepen relationships, will help us feel more connected. And then we can also, which science has shown is it becomes a whole lot more effective when it comes down to productivity. We're actually working together because of an environment with trust and caring and vulnerability as
But it has to go both ways.
yeah, it does.
Like it can't just be me oversharing or me being vulnerable. It has to be, everyone in the group or in a relationship being vulnerable, or like you're going to stop being vulnerable, right? Like you're going to be like, okay, I'm sharing my heart.
Yep.
And I am, putting all this out here, but you're not doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop because I don't feel safe and I don't trust that you are feeling the same thing.
That's why it's so important to make sure to have really an environment that we feel comfortable and where it feels like we can trust. And they'll also feel that we're hurt and the other side's giving back. Like I love that you're saying it needs to be both directions. Because otherwise,
But someone has to make the first step doing it.
yeah, somebody has to start it. Somebody has to model it for sure. And hey, you can be the one.
I almost always am.
And we know, right? We have mirror neurons. We've talked about that before. Like we mirror what other people do. So if we're the ones, if we want to have an environment where there's vulnerability to create more trust and deeper relationships, we might have to be the one started so that other
That is
people
such a great
copy it.
recognition, is the mirror neurons. Like one of us has to do it. Someone has to start it, and hopefully, the other person will respond, but like someone's got to do it, and needs to be, a group effort.
It takes really effort and energy to be the first at times. But here's a couple of things I think to when we want to start being more vulnerable. I think
What do you do?
yeah, I think the number one thing is first change your mindset that vulnerability is not a weakness. Vulnerability is really a strength because when we put ourselves out there in the appropriate amount for the right topic, it really shifts actually and the whole environment and the atmosphere. Maybe not overnight. It's a process. It does take time, but we need to go first in with a mindset, recognizing vulnerability being a necessity and a strength rather than a weakness.
Well, so then I think, we need to evaluate like
that's the next
our relationships of, okay, if you're feeling like there's something missing in your relationship, or if there's a struggle, I think you really need to self-evaluate, like how vulnerable am I being? Am I actually being vulnerable? Am I sharing but not really like super deep? Am I just talking about like, oh, the things that happened to me during the day, but I'm not really going to a deeper level?
Absolutely. And I think that really is I think that's really where coaching comes in. Because that's why I have a coach, because it's like we can to go there for ourselves, recognizing, being honest with ourselves is really hard to actually be aware of all the emotions of how we feel in certain moments and where we can share how much and it takes a while to learn that. It's a skill, we can learn it, but it does take a little while and takes a lot of reflection. So highly recommend to either having a coach. Our information is below, but also journaling is a great way to do it. And
Always.
always, as we talk about it.
We only talk about that in every episode.
But it's something to really reflect on a daily basis to, how did I show up really vulnerable, or was it so surfacey? Could have shown up more vulnerable, and how could I have shown up more vulnerable? So working
Well, and creative, I like to sit with my clients and actually like we talk a lot about vulnerability and the importance of it. And like, okay, what are the next steps? Let's create a plan on what areas of our life where I need to be more vulnerable and what's that look like? And it's different for every person, right? But what's that look like for you specifically right now in this moment in time? Like, what does vulnerability look like for you? And how can you get there? And I think it's really important to come up with that plan because very often, we just we'll shut down. We'll put up that wall and that barrier, and it's like, okay, I need to get past that. I need to like break through that wall, through that barrier, and how am I going to do that? And I know after being vulnerable, there is like a hangover, a vulnerability hangover where you're like, that was exhausting, right? Like emotionally for me, an empath, like it's exhausting and important.
No, I love that too, that you said finding different areas where where you need to show up more vulnerable. And with that, though, sometimes the interesting part is I work with my clients on that too. Obviously, start small, because if you're starting big and bold, oftentimes that is the threat response right away, right? But sometimes if we start in one area to push a little bit, and not start with the one where it's the most maybe important, but start somewhere else first, gain that confidence of showing up more vulnerable. It might actually turn to be more easy.
It'll carry over.
And carry over into the other areas of life. So if you're saying like, okay, for work, I'm not sure if I can share there, we'll start sharing in your relationship at home first, more vulnerability, and practice, so to speak, being more vulnerable, and then addressing the other way, or vice versa, right? So finding which areas of life you can be more vulnerable, and then starting somewhere where it's not too big of a leap. And
Right.
again, might carry, oftentimes actually carries over. Oftentimes it creates a momentum, and we gain, with that gain confidence, we have more courage to go out and show up even in other areas where we thought we could never do it.
Yeah. So I think the first step for everyone to take is to get their journal and evaluate and journal on, okay, where can I add more vulnerability in my life? And what's my next step? But I think just starting there is like, and then it'll start happening, right? But start with journaling because I think a lot of us, struggle with, okay, well, what's my first step? I think your first step is
First step is so important to have one
yeah,
step. I love that.
journal and figure out what areas of my life I need to find where I can be more vulnerable and what does that look like for me? Like, not what's it look like for you? What's, not how it's going to look for Brene Brown, whatever. Like, what's it look like for me in this moment in time?
Yeah, and then also really with that, it's really being more intentional, like planning.
And honest.
Yeah, you got to be honest and intentional, and almost sometimes plan it for, let's say, you have a meeting, or you have a certain conversation you want to have, to be intentional of where am I going to insert vulnerability, and also where are my boundaries, knowing where I'm going to set boundaries of things that I will not share, because that wouldn't be appropriate, or that wouldn't really matter for getting to the goal of the conversation, or whatever the goal is of the meeting. If it's not relevant for that, where's the boundary? So figuring that out too is, I think, important to get started on that. And then really it's about going out and doing and practicing. And no, it will not always feel good. It
Nope.
might be
Sometimes
like,
you're going to get shut down.
yeah, and sometimes you might find somebody not listening, or you find like yourself being, like you said, exhausted afterwards. It's not easy, and it takes courage. And so it's okay if it's sometimes not, doesn't feel good, and if it sometimes wasn't the right amount. You'll figure it out as you're doing, because if you're not practicing and figuring it out, you won't gain that skill. So you do need to go out and practice that. I think that's when also comes, and we talked about it, being kind to yourself. So even if it doesn't go as well as planned, sometimes it's okay. It's a
Give yourself
journey,
grace.
and just be kind to yourself. You still went out to make a difference and a change compared to shutting down because
Well, and give yourself, like, pat yourself on the back for doing that, because not everyone does that. It takes so much courage to be vulnerable with someone.
yeah. And one question I always love and ask my clients, I'm like, what is in there if you're not making a change? How is your life look like in a year from now if you do not show up more vulnerable?
Yeah,
Are you really getting the changes that you want?
love that question.
So that is always one to ask yourself. If I don't do anything, where will I be? So and then I think also in general, like we talked earlier, is creating that safe environment and setting for the others as well, for yourself, but for the others as well, because like you said earlier, it is a two-way street, and we need to all feel safe. So sometimes that requires to pick a certain environment that we may have
Hmm.
a tough conversation, and not have a tough conversation in some restaurant or coffee shop
Yeah,
where a lot of people walk by, where you feel like you might not want to share certain
Well, that also means that as the person who is taking on information, if you want people to be vulnerable with you, that means that you have to be the trusted person, right? That doesn't mean that you go and talk to someone else about this. It
yeah,
doesn't mean that you go and share their information with other people. Like, if you want people to be vulnerable with you, you have to be the trusted person. And just like you wouldn't want to share something with someone and have them go tell so and so down the street, you need to be the person who's trustworthy.
yep, yep, absolutely. And like I said, at the end, really the biggest part is it's part of personal growth, and personal growth can be hard and it's difficult. But if we are committed to that, really constantly growing, then that that would give you a push. Or otherwise, if you have a hard time with that, I mean, one big part again too, and I know it's part of your coaching as well, is to know what is my why, what do I want,
And your values.
what is the value. So if you're struggling with that, connect to your values, connect to your why, to your purpose, and that will help you to kind of push yourself a little bit, I think, out of that comfort zone
hmm
that we're in. And again, just a small step, I think. But at the end of the day, vulnerability is not a weakness at all.
No,
It's
it
strength.
takes so much courage to be vulnerable and to show up in a vulnerable way
Yeah,
and to cry in front of someone.
yeah, but it is crucial for building a an environment of trust, deeper relationships, connection, which is vital for
hmm
personal growth, but also for our health and well-being.